Hi folks, I'm smoking my cob on Cob Tuesday, and in it I've got some half and half that was given to me by the Happy-Go-Lucky Piper, and I want to thank him now for it because it's a lovely smoke. I didn't think I would like a Virginia Burley, but it's got a lovely topping on it, and it makes a nice, long, gentle smoke. And burns down to a fine white ash. Tonight I want to share with you two true stories and then talk a little bit about things that might be good for Halloween. The first one is about a friend of ours and his wife and baby. We were at their flat and the baby was at that stage where he used language infrequently but did a lot of baby talk. And one night we heard noise coming from the bedroom, so his mother went and opened the door, which all the rooms on the flat were on the same floor, so she didn't have far to go. She immediately came back and called us over. And we were outside the room and we were looking through the door, and the young toddler was in his cot, stood at the end, and appeared to be holding a conversation with somebody we couldn't see. But he would either use baby language or would say the few words that he knew, and then he would listen and maybe nod and then respond. And this went on for 10 minutes. All the time we were convinced that he was talking to somebody we couldn't see. At the end of about 10 minutes, he turned around and reached one of his toys in the cot and handed it over the cot as if he was wanting the person to take it. And something was said by that person, and he put the toy down and listened for a moment and then said, "Ta-ta," turned round, lay down, and went immediately to sleep. To say we were shaken is an understatement. I was working in a factory at the time, and at that time I'd had very little experience with things like this. The other thing about the flat that they lived in was Tim had several guns. Nearly all of them were licensed, including some shotguns, and he was an expert on the English sporting rifle shotgun. So much so that one of the big companies that sold shotguns would often refer their customers to him if they had questions that they couldn't answer, and Tim would answer them. Amongst his licensed guns, he had a 12-inch Luger, and he had a Browning high power 9mm automatic. And on his unlicensed guns, he had a 12-inch Luger, a broom-handled Mauser, and I forget the other pistol. I think it was a Walther, but I don't know what, not what make, I've forgotten. But the problem he had was that he kept all his guns locked up. There was a wire that went through all the trigger guards, and there was also a thing that came down on the top of the rifles and held them in, and on the bottom, so they had to be undone, and the wire had to be undone before any of the guns could be removed. But the 12-inch unlicensed Luger had disappeared. He'd opened the cabinet one day and it had gone. Couldn't find it anywhere and was very worried. And on this particular day we were at the flat with them and we were just talking, as you do with friends, sat in different chairs, and there was the sound of something dropping on the floor. And when we looked, the 12-inch Luger was spinning in the middle between the four of us. Now, none of us had moved. I know that because I could see three other people, Carolyn, Lynn's wife. Sorry, I've said Lynn. That wasn't his name. But and he was at the opposite. So I could see him, and he had his hands in front of him. In fact, I think we were both smoking at the time, smoking cigarettes. This was when I worked at the factory. And we made friends because Carolyn delivered the little toddler that I told you about, because she was a nurse at Leeds and she was on the gynae ward at the time. And her and the mother had become really good friends. So he bent down and picked up the Luger and looked at it and checked the number, checked that it was empty. I mean, it should have been, because he never left guns loaded. And then said, after we talked a bit about what the hell happened there, he said, I'll just get the other Luger. I want to try something out with you. There's something odd about this unlicensed gun. And he gave Carolyn the other 12-inch Luger, and she was looking at it, and she knew how to open it and that kind of thing, and looked down the barrel, looked, just as you would with a gun. And then she passed it to me, and I looked at it, and great, it's a Luger, 12-inch, wartime made, or just before the war. Could see nothing unusual about it. It had German military markings on it. The other gun, as soon as he passed it to Carolyn, she jumped, and she almost went to throw the gun away. And she said, "Here, you have it." And I got hold of it, and I wanted to throw it away. It just felt, I don't like this. There's something wrong with it. And I handed it over to Tim, and Tim said, I've got a story about that gun. He said, as far as I know, both guns are from the same period. They're both military weapons. The difference is that the gun that you didn't like was used by a friend to commit suicide. And he did it properly. He put the gun in his mouth, pulled the trigger, and blew the top of his head off. After the inquest, and the verdict was suicide when the balance of the mind was disturbed, the gun was given back to the family, and they immediately gave it to Tim. That was his name, by the way. And he had to clean it before he could put it in the cabinet, and it was, as you can imagine, in a mess. But he said, ever since the man committed suicide with the gun, it just felt bad. And so when it disappeared and reappeared, it was an extra concern what had gone wrong. And when Tim and his wife moved, there were no other odd things that happened to them. The baby was okay. No more talking to strangers or in the bed or whatever. Now I want to talk a little bit about headless ghosts because Matches told a story of a headless ghost. And in England we've got a lot of headless ghosts. Or at least stories of headless ghosts. And I'm sure that's because the method of execution used in England at one time was beheading with an axe. Now, the terrible thing about the English execution axe is that it's not built for the job. It's unbalanced. So to strike the head cleanly is a matter of skill that most people don't have. Because as you brought the blade down, it just would hit anywhere except straight and clean. And a lot of times anyway, the executioner wasn't the best at sharpening his axe. There's a story of one man who was to suffer execution with the axe, and he was struck 3 times before he turned to the executioner and said, "If you don't strike cleanly, I am not sure how much longer I can keep my head still," which I think showed a remarkable amount of guts and courage. And he placed his head back on the block, and thank God the executioner struck off his head cleanly. But Anne Boleyn, who was to be executed, was the exception to the executioner's axe. Because of her family and her background, the king decided to be merciful, and it was decided she would be executed by sword. And the best executioners by sword were the French executioners. They were very skilled at their job. So it was sent over to France for a French executioner, and he came with his assistant. And on the day of the execution, he'd sharpened his weapon and he'd tested it, and then he put the weapon underneath the straw that was on the execution stage to mop up blood and that kind of thing. Anne was to be executed kneeling. She was just asked to kneel as straight and still as possible. The executioner had given his assistant instructions, and after Anne had said her prayers and commended the King's Majesty to the love of God and to the love of the people, the executioner's assistant said, "Anne," and she turned to look at him. And as she did so, the executioner picked up the sword, swung it, and struck off her head before she even knew what was happening. And that was an act of great mercy, I thought. And he was so skilled that he decided to do that, A, to make it easy, because she would have the back of the neck stuff to him and he would slice from the side. And that way he wouldn't worry about hitting the bone. The job would be done before she knew it. One last story about executioners. One of the best executioners, I think he was either French or German. He was a man called Sanson. And he was a very, very skilled executioner. He was asked to produce several methods of execution. He broke people on the wheel, which meant that they would be crucified, tied to the wheel, and he would begin with the legs, and he would break every bone in their body, legs first, arms second, ribs, spine, and then the killing blow to the head. A barbaric method. he once was asked to boil a man, which he did. He was asked to the usual forms of execution: hung, drawn, quartering, burning at the stake, and beheading. And he was so skillful, he knew more about the executioner's art than anybody else. And I think his family followed in his footsteps. But a lot of the local people used him as a free doctor because he knew as much about the body as anybody else. And he had several potions that he could give the people. But I'm going to stop there, because otherwise I shall just go on forever. But I want to wish you a very happy Halloween. Just be aware and be on the lookout for the lost souls that might appear, for the ancestors that might come to visit, and for those things that go bump in the night. Sleep well, my friend.